the moment I finally understood that my normal life had fallen apart. I had lost my job at the beginning of the month. At first, I thought I'd find a new one quickly, but days passed, then weeks, and nothing came of it. At interviews, they kept feeding me promises. Employers said they'd call back, but of course, nobody ever did. My money was disappearing faster than snow in April, while my debts, on the contrary, were growing so eagerly it was as if someone were paying them extra for effort. I fell behind on rent, borrowed from friends, then from acquaintances, and by the end I was forcing myself to answer calls from unknown numbers because I already knew nothing good was waiting for me on the other end. At times like that, a person stops choosing and starts grabbing at any opportunity, any side job, any chance to climb out of the hole, even for a single day. That's why when I came across a job ad for work at a construction site, it felt almost like a gift from fate. They needed someone for the night shift. The pay was above average. Accommodation on site was free. The duties were minimal. Sit there, they said. Make sure no one sneaks in while the project is frozen. No special experience required. The main thing was to stay sober, stay alert, and not miss a shift. Now, looking back on all of it, I realized that even then, there was something sticky, unpleasant about that ad. It looked too smooth. The wording was too perfect. The conditions were too generous for a job that, by description, demanded next to nothing. But at that moment, I didn't care. When there's barely enough left in your wallet for a pack of pasta and bus fare, suspicion gives way to desperation. I called the number that same day. A man answered. His voice was low, smoke-worn, and tired. The kind of voice people have when they've been sleeping in fragments for a long time, smoking too much, and speaking too little. He introduced himself as Jack Morgan. The name sounded almost cinematic, but the man himself spoke without any flourish. Short, clipped, as if every extra word was a burden. He didn't ask me a pile of questions, didn't care about my past experience or references. He only asked whether I'd been drinking lately, whether I had any trouble with the law, and whether I was ready to start in 2 days. Of course, I said yes. Then I'll see you in the evening, he said. Come to the old warehouse on Hammer Street. You know where that is? I did. The neighborhood was half dead. Old hangars, tire shops, ruined workshops, and a couple of cheap diners for truckers. Not the kind of place where serious interviews are usually held. But again, I wasn't in any position to be picky. I arrived early that evening. It was windy, damp, and yesterday's puddles still gleamed on the asphalt. An old dark pickup truck was parked by the warehouse. A man in a gray jacket stood beside it smoking. When I came closer, he flicked the cigarette to the ground, crushed it under his boot, and looked at me as if he were already calculating how long I'd last. That was Jack Morgan. 45, maybe a little older, solidly built, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked as if it had been chopped out with an axe. Hard cheekbones, deep lines at the corners of his eyes, stubble, closely cropped hair, going gray at the temples. He didn't give the impression of a man you wanted to argue with, and certainly not one you wanted to ask too many questions. We went into a small diner across the street. Inside, it smelled like coffee, grease, and old plastic. Jack ordered black coffee. He told me to get whatever I wanted, but I had no appetite. I settled for a mug of cheap tea. The job is simple, he said without even looking at me. There's a site, construction of a big residential complex. Everything froze back in winter. Funding got cut, part of the crew was let go, but the equipment, materials, and some of the machinery are still there. So they need somebody on shift, at night, to make sure nobody gets in. Metal gets stolen a lot these days. And teenagers wander in too sometimes, looking for a thrill. No security? I asked. There was, he said. Then they decided that it was cheaper to keep one man on site. He said it so calmly, as if he were talking about replacing a light bulb. He explained that the construction site was out in the middle of nowhere, closer to the industrial zone outside the city. The only way to get there was by car. There was a trailer on site, a generator, zapas of water and food. Cell service was bad, sometimes non-existent. The shift lasted a week. 1 week there, 1 week off. The pay really was good. Too good for that kind of work, especially by my standards. Why do they pay so much? I asked anyway. Jack took a sip of coffee, stayed quiet for a couple of seconds, then shrugged. Middle of nowhere. Night shift. People don't like loneliness, and the place, he paused. It's not the coziest. What do you mean, not the coziest? For the first time, he looked me straight in the eye. I mean, a lot of people leave fast. Why? They can't handle it. Handle what exactly? He smirked. But there wasn't a trace of humor in it. The silence, he said, and their own thoughts. I decided he was just trying to build atmosphere. Some bosses are like that. They like throwing out strange lines with a serious face, so they seem more mysterious than they really are. Then he mentioned in passing that there had been an accident at the site. Some worker had supposedly fallen from an upper floor of one of the unfinished buildings. Investigation, paperwork, work stoppage. He said it as if he were retelling somebody else's story, one that hadn't touched him in a long time. I didn't ask questions. The money hanging in front of me was too bright. We agreed that in 2 days he'd pick me up in the morning and we'd drive to the site together. The whole time I felt like I was making, if not the best choice, at least a reasonable one. I even felt a strange kind of relief, as if life had finally stopped rolling me downhill and let me grab onto something. I didn't know yet that that evening I had really just stepped into a place not everyone left the same way they arrived. On the day we left, the sky was covered in a flat gray overcast. Jack arrived on time. I tossed my backpack into the bed of the pickup, got in beside him, and we headed out. At first, we drove through the city, morning traffic, buses, people carrying takeaway coffee, the usual weekday rush. Then, the neighborhoods thinned out. Houses gave way to warehouses, auto shops, fences, and industrial lots. After that came wasteland, an occasional gas station, and long strips of cracked asphalt bordered by gray fields with patches of dry grass. Jack smoked one cigarette after another. The radio in the truck rasped out some old rock song. Sometimes he said something practical about the job, where the keys were kept, how to start the generator, where the spare fuel was, where the water was. It was useful enough, but there was a strange weariness in his voice. Not physical weariness, but the kind a man carries when he's been dragging around something inside himself for a long time and never telling anyone about it. When we turned off the main road onto a broken access track, the landscape became completely deserted. We passed the skeletons of unfinished warehouses, rusted containers, piles of concrete slabs overgrown with weeds. In places, the road had been washed out. The pickup jolted in potholes, and the sky above us grew heavier and darker. How much farther? I asked, mostly just to break the silence. Almost there, Jack muttered. Main rule. Don't go looking for trouble. This isn't that kind of place. What do you mean? I mean exactly that. He crushed his cigarette into the ashtray and added, do your rounds, sit in the trailer, don't stick your nose where it doesn't belong, and the week will pass just fine. He said it like an ordinary instruction, but for some reason that line stuck in my head. Don't stick your nose where it doesn't belong. People say things like that too often in places where sticking your nose somewhere forbidden is exactly what you want to do. A few minutes later, we pulled up to the construction site gates. The first impression was like arriving not at a work site, but at the set of some grim movie. A huge fenced-off area. Behind it, the dark outlines of several unfinished residential blocks. A tower crane frozen against the sky like the skeleton of some giant bird. Concrete shells of floors black with empty window openings, rows of exposed rebar, piles of slabs, containers, rain-filled trenches, and not a single person anywhere. Even for a frozen construction site, the place looked too empty. Right by the gate stood the trailer, a long site cabin, chipped, rust-stained, but solid-looking enough. Nearby, a generator rattled under a metal awning. A little farther off stood a portable toilet, a wash basin with a water tank, and a pile of construction materials covered by tarp. Everything necessary seemed to be there, yet the place still felt not just frozen, but abandoned in a hurry. Jack unlocked the gate, drove the pickup inside, and killed the engine. When I stepped out of the truck, a chill ran unpleasantly down my back. Not from the weather, but from the atmosphere of the place itself. It was quiet. So quiet that even the rattling of the generator seemed alive against all that concrete stillness. "Well, here are your apartments," Jack said with a nod toward the trailer. Inside it was cramped but manageable. A narrow bed with a spring mattress, a table, a wooden chair, an old cabinet, an electric heater, a small refrigerator, a couple of shelves, a kettle. On the table sat a pack of disposable dishes, a flashlight, a box of matches, and candles. In one corner stood several water canisters. On the floor was a crate filled with canned food, grain, noodles, and other long-lasting groceries. "Enough for a week," Jack said. "More than enough. Don't turn off the generator. Ever. There's enough fuel. If it starts acting up, check the tank, the spark plug, the wiring. But at night, don't mess with it unless there's a real reason." "Why, especially at night?" For a moment he looked not at me, but toward the nearest building, as if he were listening to something far away. "Because at night," he said, "everything sounds different here." I didn't like the answer, but I chalked it up to his habit of talking in cryptic lines. Then we walked the site. Jack showed me the route for my rounds: the gate, the fence perimeter, the containers, the equipment yard, the temporary workshop, the passage between the first and second buildings, the concrete ramp to the underground level, and the fenced-off elevator shaft, which he immediately told me not to go near. "Why?" "There's already been one accident there," he said shortly. "I don't need another." He gave me a ring of keys, an old walkie-talkie that turned out to work only inside the site since there was no one to contact, and a clipboard with a paper shift log. "Write down your rounds if you feel like it," he said. Then we went back to the trailer. Before leaving, Jack unloaded a couple more boxes and cast one last look over the site. A look I liked less and less. It didn't read like irritation or even anxiety. It was something closer to resigned acceptance. As if he had known something about this place for far too long, something better left unspoken. "They'll pick you up next Saturday morning," he said. "You'll get service on the roof of the trailer or by the gate, but not always. If it's urgent, send a text. It might go through, but nothing should happen." He paused, then added, "The main thing is, don't try to play hero at night." "What could even happen here?" I asked before I could stop myself. Jack opened the truck door, but before getting in, he answered anyway. "Something always happens on a construction site." Then he drove away. The sound of the engine faded beyond the gate. And then the silence fell on me for real. Before it had been cut by the motor, footsteps, a voice. Now all that remained was the generator, the faint wind, and the concrete emptiness all around. It suddenly became clear to me that I was alone on an enormous site, among unfinished buildings, miles from normal life, with no proper signal and no people. It was unpleasant and strangely invigorating at the same time. I kept trying to tell myself it was all fine. A week would pass quickly. I'd endure it, sit it out, take the money, and forget the place. I spent the first half of the day settling in. I put away the food, checked the cabinet, made the bed, counted the water again. Inside, the trailer seemed smaller than it had from outside. The old wood creaked, the walls were slightly warped, and the windows were cloudy, with streaks of old dirt in the corners. It smelled of dust, metal, and something stale. The kind of smell places have when people technically live in them, but only unwillingly. What was stranger was this. Despite Jack saying the previous shift worker had been here almost until the other day, the trailer looked as though no one had been in it for a long time. There was a layer of dust on the table. In the corner, I found an old nail, a rusty mug, and an empty cigarette pack, already faded with age. Under the bed were scraps of packaging film. In the cabinet, a couple of broken hangers and some dirty cloth sack. I thought maybe all of that had simply been left over from older times, and the recent worker just hadn't cleaned. But the detail still scratched at me in an unpleasant way. Toward evening, I made my first round. At first, it was even a little interesting. I walked around with the flashlight, checking the fence, peering into passages, testing the locks on the containers. Gravel crunched under my boots. Somewhere, a loose sheet of metal knocked in the wind. The flashlight beam caught rebar, piles of brick, wet concrete walls. When I passed the first building and looked up, the empty window openings on the upper floors looked like black holes. Looking down, silent. Nothing strange happened. But the whole time I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone on the site. Not in the sense that there was a thief or a drifter hiding somewhere. No. More like the place itself was watching me warily, studying me, taking my measure. Back in the trailer, I couldn't fall asleep for a long time. Something would creak in the wall, or the wind would shift a sheet of metal, or the generator would change the pitch of its rattling. Ordinary sounds, but in that kind of silence, each one seemed too loud and too personal. I fell asleep only near dawn. The next day, boredom hit. I suppose not everyone handled that very well. When there are no people around, no internet, no proper service, no sounds of civilization, time starts moving differently. Slowly, thickly. Each hour seems longer than the last. I ate, did another round, sat in the trailer again, scrolled through old messages on my phone, which barely caught any signal, tried to nap, then went outside again. By noon, the sky had turned completely dark. Heavy clouds hung over the unfinished buildings. The air grew damp and cold. It felt as though rain was about to start, but it just kept holding off. To give myself something to do, I decided to sort through the cabinet and the junk in the trailer. And that was when I found the thing that really knocked me off balance. On the top shelf, behind an old box of wires and some empty canisters, there was a thick black notebook, worn, with rounded corners and stains from moisture on the cover. Written across it in white marker were the words, "Shift log." I actually smirked. Bureaucracy, I thought. Probably just the shift journal, where guards or watchmen wrote down rounds, remarks, and other routine nonsense. I sat at the table and opened it. The first pages were exactly what I expected. Dates, times, notes. March 18th. Started shift at 2000. Site normal. Generator working. March 19th. Perimeter inspection at 1 a.m. No violations found. March 20th. Rain. Ramp slippery. Dog tracks by the south fence. And so on. Dry, dull, repetitive. But somewhere around the middle of the notebook, I noticed a sheet of paper sticking out between the pages, folded into quarters. Not just a bookmark, a note hidden carefully. I unfolded it. The handwriting was uneven and rushed. In places, the letters seemed to crawl apart, as if the person had written it on their knee or in a hurry. The text began without greeting. If you're reading this, that means you're new. And if nobody told you anything, then everything is still the same. It's easier for them to hire another person than explain why nobody stays here. If you want to make it through the end of the week, you'll have to follow a few rules. I read those first lines 3 times. 2 explanations came to mind immediately. Either it was somebody's stupid joke born of boredom or an attempt to scare the new guy. Things like that happen on sites. People love initiating newcomers into traditions, especially when there's nothing else to do. But for some reason, I felt uneasy. I turned the page over. There was a list. Rule 1. Never turn off the generator at night, even if the noise makes you want to smash it with a sledgehammer. As long as there's light and noise, it keeps its distance. Rule 2. After midnight, do not go into the buildings, any of them. Even if you hear footsteps, coughing, voices, tools, or someone calling for help, there is nobody there. Rule 3. If someone from the upper floors calls your name, don't answer and don't look up right away. Move toward the light first. Rule 4. If the generator dies at night, don't leave the trailer for the first 10 minutes, no matter what happens outside. Rule 5. If someone knocks on the door and calls you in a familiar voice, don't open. It can't come in unless you open it yourself. Rule 6. Never go down to the underground level after sunset. Rule 7. If you see a person in a hard hat facing the wall, leave in silence. Don't call out to him. Don't come closer. Rule 8. If you hear metal striking concrete directly beneath the trailer, sit still and count to 100. It's checking where you are. If you think I've gone insane, I thought so too at first, until I saw what I saw. If you want to live, don't play hero. No signature, no date. I slowly set the page down on the table and stared at it. Every rational part of me said it was a prank. A normal, stupid prank. Somebody sat here bored, invented a scary story, wrote survival rules, and hid them for the next shift. Maybe the whole crew used to entertain themselves like that. Maybe Jack knew and laughed about it. Maybe the previous guy had simply been some nervous idiot. But the other part of me, the part that tightens inside you when you're walking down an empty street at night and suddenly feel someone's gaze and wasn't laughing at all. The timing was just too perfect. Jack's strange words, the look he kept giving the sight, the oppressive silence, the feeling that something here was studying me. I was about to put the note back when I noticed that farther into the notebook, several pages were written in much less orderly handwriting than the first entries. These weren't just reports. They were almost a diary. Tuesday. Heard footsteps upstairs again in the second building. At first I thought it was the wind, metal shifting. Then, clearly, 3 steps, pause, 3 more. Didn't go check. I'm not stupid. Wednesday. Generator flickered at 2:13. At the same moment, something passed the trailer window. Only saw the shadow. Too tall to be a person. Thursday. A light was on at the 3rd floor of the first building. Impossible. There's no power. Watched it for 10 seconds, then it went out. I'm not going back there alone. Friday. It knows my name. The line ended there. The next page had been torn out. Suddenly, I felt very cold, even though the heater was still running and the generator rattled outside the wall. I closed the notebook and sat still for a long time. The trailer was so quiet that I could hear my own breathing and the faint creak of metal somewhere in one of the buildings. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I tried distracting myself, ate, drank tea, tried reading something on my phone, went outside twice. But my thoughts kept circling back to the note. The rational part of me stubbornly repeated, "You're an adult. It's a joke. You're being wound up." But the anxiety only kept growing. I caught myself glancing off and out the window at the generator and almost calming down at its noise. The sound that had irritated me in the morning began to feel reliable by evening. The second night began quietly. I made a round around 11. Rain still hadn't started, but the air had grown even heavier. The wind died completely. That was strange. In open places like that, something is always moving. Rebar ringing, plastic sheeting fluttering, sheet metal whining. But here, almost complete stillness. Only the generator crackling and very far away, the occasional dull hum of the highway. Back in the trailer, I locked the door, made coffee, and sat by the window. I tried not to look at the buildings. I wasn't very successful. Around midnight, I heard the first sound. Not outside, not at the fence, not from the wind. From inside the site, metal scraping, as if someone were dragging something heavy and sharp across concrete. The sound was short but distinct. I froze, the mug suspended in my hand. A few seconds passed. Nothing. I almost thought I'd imagined it. Then it came again. Longer this time. Scrap! Somewhere in the first building, my heart started hammering faster. I slowly set the mug down on the table and listened. Then came a dull clang. Another. Then something metallic seemed to fall and roll across the concrete. The sound echoed hollowly. I stepped toward the door. And immediately, a line from the note flashed in my head. After midnight, do not go into the buildings. Ridiculous, of course. To obey somebody's scribbled nonsense like survival instructions? But I still stopped. The sounds didn't fade. On the contrary, they became more varied, as if somebody inside were walking around moving tools, dragging rebar, opening and closing metal doors that, as far as I remembered, weren't even there. A couple minutes later, I heard something worse. Footsteps, slow, heavy, on the concrete slabs above. They were moving from higher up down toward lower levels. Or at least that's what it sounded like. Then they stopped. After that, from the darkness of the building came a faint whistle. Not wind, a whistle. Human. Just a few notes. Simple but completely wrong for that place and that hour. A shiver ran through me. I backed away from the door and returned to the table. I wanted to put on music on my phone, but there was no service, and the battery was already half gone. So instead, I sat on the bed, pulled my jacket tighter around me, and waited for it to stop. About 10 minutes later, a voice sounded. Very quiet. Quiet enough that at first, I didn't even know whether I'd really heard it. "Hey!" I froze. The voice came from somewhere above, from the direction of the first building. "Hey! Is anyone there?" A man's voice, raspy, tired. I stared out the window, but saw nothing except gray outlines of concrete and black window openings. "Help!" That word came a little clearer. Something tightened in my chest. No matter how stupid the note seemed, hearing a cry for help at night from a frozen construction site was different. Logic immediately started offering possibilities. Someone had actually broken in, fallen, broken a leg, couldn't get out. Or a homeless man had sheltered there and gotten into trouble. Or some thrill-seeking teenager. I had almost started to rise when the voice came again, louder this time. "Can you hear me?" And then, "Come here." And that was the moment everything inside me went cold for real. Because the last words were spoken with my name. "Come here, Matt. My name is Matt." I hadn't told it to anyone except Jack, and no stranger could possibly have known that I was the one on site that night. I jerked away from the window and nearly overturned the chair. In my head, one of the rules flared up. If someone from the upper floors calls your name, don't answer and don't look up right away. Move toward the light first. Without thinking, I backed closer to the lamp hanging from the trailer ceiling, fed by the generator. The sounds outside stopped at once, so suddenly that it was even worse than the sounds themselves, as if something had realized the bait hadn't worked. I spent the rest of the night barely moving. Sometimes it seemed to me that somebody was walking under the windows. Sometimes there was a faint metallic tapping, but nothing as obvious as before happened again. Near dawn, I must have dozed off in the chair. I woke in daylight because the trailer had grown stuffy. Outside, a thin drizzle was falling. My head felt heavy, like after sleeplessness and a bad dream. But what had happened during the night had not been a dream. I remembered the voice too vividly, and especially my own name, coming from the dark opening of an unfinished floor. All that day I tried to keep myself normal. I talked out loud just to hear a human voice. I made strong tea, I did extra rounds early. I checked the generator even though nothing was wrong with it. A couple of times I even walked up to the first building in daylight and looked inside. Nothing. Empty floors, puddles, old dirt tracks, rebar, broken plywood, no people, no signs of anyone. Only deep inside, near the stairwell, I noticed something that looked like an old yellow hard hat. I didn't go closer. When evening came, the anxiety returned. Wednesday. Exactly Wednesday, as the notebook had said, was when it starts for real. I didn't want to remember those entries, but they kept surfacing on their own. I don't know whether it was suggestion or whether the place truly did change after dark, but by night the air at the site seemed thicker. Even the light from the trailer lamp looked dull and woolly somehow. Around 11, I made another round. Everything looked fine. When I passed the entrance to the first building, I had the urge to quickly glance up and check the upper floors. I didn't. I just walked faster. Back in the trailer, I locked both locks, drew the curtains, and sat at the table listening to the generator. Its steady rattling was almost hypnotic. A little after midnight, the silence finally cracked. This time, not with scraping, with footsteps. Something was walking clearly across the roof of the trailer. Not running, not jumping. Walking slowly, heavily. One side, pause, 2 steps, the squeal of metal, pause, then back again. I looked up at the ceiling and felt goose flesh rise all over my skin. The roof was thin. If it had been a bird, the sound would have been different. If it had been a cat, even more so. Whatever was up there was much heavier. I stood so abruptly the chair scraped across the floor. The footsteps on the roof stopped instantly. Silence. I stood there, holding my breath. And then, 3 dull blows from below, directly under the floor of the trailer. Boom. Pause. Boom. Pause. Boom. I slowly lowered my gaze to the floor. Rule 8. If you hear metal striking concrete directly beneath the trailer, sit still and count to 100. It's checking where you are. I don't know why that line hit me so hard. Maybe because it was the one I remembered most clearly. Maybe because the situation matched it too exactly. I sat down on the bed, clenched my teeth, and started counting in my head. 1, 2, 3. My heart pounded so hard it felt as if it must be audible outside. 4, 5, 6. At 42, something slowly scraped along the outer wall of the trailer. A long, sickening metallic drag, as though some long iron claw were running across it. I nearly broke and rushed for the door. But I counted to 100. After that, everything went quiet, not for long. About 20 minutes later, the generator died. It didn't sputter, didn't cough, didn't slowly fail. It was running, and then, suddenly, it wasn't. The lamp under the ceiling flickered once and went out. The heater clicked off, and the trailer dropped into pitch-black darkness. The cold inside me spread so fast, it felt like someone had thrown open a refrigerator inside my chest. I jumped to my feet. The instinct was obvious. Run out, check the generator, get the light back. Without it, the entire site became one solid black void. I even found the flashlight, and that was when Rule 4 flashed up in my mind. If the generator dies at night, don't leave the trailer for the first 10 minutes, no matter what happens outside. I stopped at the door, breathing hard. Outside came a faint rustle, then footsteps on gravel. Then someone quietly tugged the door handle. Once, a second time, a third. No knocking, no trying to break in, just testing, carefully, as if checking whether it was locked. I backed away so fast I nearly dropped the flashlight. In the total darkness, the trailer seemed to shrink to the size of a coffin. I understood that if I turned on the light or the flashlight and went to the window now, I might see something there I'd never be able to unsee. The footsteps circled the trailer slowly, left to right. Then again, sand and gravel crunched faintly. Sometimes whatever it was brushed the wall with fingers, or whatever passed for fingers. A thin metallic ringing traveled across the siding, then came knocking at the door. 3 times, quietly. Then, a voice. Matt! I froze. It was Jack's voice. The same low, tired, smoke-roughened voice I'd heard in the truck and in the diner. Matt, open up. It's me. I said nothing. The generator's out. We need to take a look. Open up. He spoke calmly, almost lazily, like a man who saw nothing strange in the situation. That made it even worse. I took half a step closer, but stayed silent. My head was buzzing. Part of me desperately wanted to believe it really was Jack. Maybe he had come to check on the site. Maybe he'd seen the generator die and walked over. Maybe I just hadn't heard the truck because of the weather, because I'd been half asleep. But there had been no rain. And I would have heard the gate, the engine, the headlights. Matt, the voice said again, you fall asleep in there or what? Then, almost immediately, the intonation changed. Softer, pleading. Open up. I stepped backward. The knocks on the door grew stronger. Matt! Then came a pause. 10 seconds of complete silence. And after that, from the other side of the door, a completely different voice. A woman's. Soft. Crying. Please, I'm cold. Every hair on the back of my neck stood up. The voice was alien. It had no possible connection to the site. No woman could have been out there in the middle of nowhere at night at my door. But it sounded so human, so pitiful, that for the first second I really did feel myself jerk toward the lock. Please, open! I clenched my teeth, sat down on the floor in the far corner of the trailer, and wrapped my arms around my knees like a child. My heart pounded against my ribs so hard, I thought I might pass out. Then more voices spoke outside. They kept changing. First Jack, then the woman, then some old man. Then, worst of all, a child's thin voice pleading softly, Mister, let me in. I sat there without moving or answering. Every cell in my body screamed that I needed to do something. Scream, run, turn on the flashlight, burst outside. But I stayed where I was. After 5 minutes, or maybe half an hour, I had lost all sense of time. Everything went silent. The silence was so deep, I could hear my blood pulsing in my ears. Then, suddenly, a click, and the generator started again, on its own. Abruptly, as if someone had switched it back on. The lamp flared to life overhead. The trailer lit up. Everything was the same again. Table, bed, cabinet, my boots by the door, the mug on the table. But along with that came the terrible realization. Whatever had been outside had not disappeared because I'd imagined it. It disappeared because the light and the noise bothered it again. I spent the rest of the night sitting there, fully dressed, flashlight in my hand, my eyes fixed on the door. Morning didn't feel like salvation. It felt like a pause. Thursday brought rain. A downpour hammered the roof of the trailer without stopping. The whole site was swallowed by a gray curtain. The distant buildings blurred in the fog and drizzle like scenery from someone else's dream. In daylight, everything looked almost normal, until I remembered the night. I went out to check the generator. The tank was almost full. The wiring was intact. There was no sign of any malfunction. How it could have simply died and then started itself, I couldn't understand. Worse than that were the tracks I noticed in the dirt by the trailer. Not boots, not work shoes, not really human at all. They were too long, smeared as if whatever made them walked, without fully touching the ground. They stretched from the back wall of the trailer toward the first building and disappeared where the dirt gave way to concrete. I stood over them for a long time, feeling the anxiety spread through me again. Then I went back inside and opened the notebook. On the last pages, I found several more entries. If it has started speaking, it means it's already gotten used to you. Don't trust the voices. Don't trust anyone asking for help. First, it watches, then it imitates, then it calls. Worst of all is if you see it during the day, then it's already very close. The last sentence had been crossed out so violently the paper had torn in places. I barely held myself together until evening. Not because anything new was happening, but because my mind was simply refusing to digest the situation any longer. I wanted desperately to hear a human voice, to feel anyone living near me. I tried several times to catch signal and send a message to someone I knew, but my phone would show one bar and then lose it again. I did manage to type a text to Jack. Generator died at night. Strange sounds on site. Call me back. The message never sent. Toward evening, I made a mistake, a big one. I decided to check the first building more thoroughly in daylight than I had before. Even now, I don't fully know why. Probably simple human stubbornness. When something invisible has been frightening you for too long, you want to poke it and say, "There, see? There's nothing." I wanted to prove to myself that all of it was either suggestion or somebody's clever game. I took the flashlight and went inside. The first floor smelled of wet concrete, dust, and dampness. Water squelched underfoot. Somewhere above, a loose wire rang faintly. I moved slowly toward the stairwell. Daylight still reached in through the empty window openings, so the darkness wasn't total, only gray and washed out. I climbed to the second floor, empty. Third, also empty. On the fourth floor, at the far end of the corridor, I saw a figure. A person in a yellow hard hat stood with his back to me, facing the concrete wall. I stopped. At first, I didn't even understand what I was looking at. The figure was too motionless. Not just standing still, frozen. Arms hanging straight down, head slightly bowed. Clothes? What looked like an ordinary work jacket and pants. Everything about it looked so ordinary that it became especially terrifying. The rule flashed up in my head: if you see a person in a hard hat facing the wall, leave in silence. Don't call to him. Don't go near. It was like being doused in ice. My thoughts instantly became very simple. Turn around. Leave. Now. I had already taken a step backward when the figure slowly lifted one hand and pressed its palm to the wall. Then the other hand. Then it leaned forward slightly, as if listening to something inside the wall. I couldn't take it. I stepped back faster. A small stone cracked under my boot. The figure froze. Then it began to turn its head very slowly over its shoulder. I didn't see the face. I didn't wait to. I spun around and half ran down the stairs. No footsteps, no cry, no sound came after me. Only when I burst out into the rain and looked back at the building did I see the empty opening on the fourth floor. No one there. After that, I didn't try to convince myself everything was normal anymore. The night from Thursday into Friday became the longest night of my life. As soon as darkness fell, the rain intensified. Water hammered the roof of the trailer, streamed down the walls, splashed into puddles. The rain should have muffled everything else, but instead it made every foreign sound stand out more sharply. I sat on the bed fully dressed, with the flashlight beside me and a knife I'd found in the toolbox. I knew the knife was useless against whatever moved outside, but holding on to something made it easier. Around midnight, the walkie-talkie suddenly crackled. It had been silent all day because there was no one to communicate with. But now static hissed through the speaker, followed by a broken voice. "Come in. Who's on? Can you hear?" I grabbed the radio. "Who is this? Come in." The static intensified. "Below. Don't look. Down." Then more crackling. The voice was distorted but human, male. I listened greedily, hoping it was Jack, security, anyone at all. Then, through the noise, one word cut through clearly. "Run." The radio died. I held it to my ear for a few seconds more, then slowly lowered it to my lap. And at that exact moment, outside, right beside the wall of the trailer, someone laughed. Not loudly, not hysterically. Quietly, wetly. As if someone with a crushed throat were laughing. I don't remember how I got onto the floor. One instant I was sitting on the bed. The next I was pressed with my back to the wall. Knife held out in front of me. The laughter came again from the other side of the trailer. Then footsteps. Then tapping on the glass. Once, twice, 3 times. I didn't look at the window. I couldn't. I knew that if I turned my head, I would either see something that would break me completely, or curiosity would finish the job. Then a voice sounded. This time, my own. "Matt!" Something inside me collapsed. It was me. My voice, my inflection, my exact way of speaking. As if there were another me standing outside, trying my speech on for size. "Matt, open up." Then the same voice again, quieter, almost a whisper. "You're going to open it soon anyway." I squeezed my eyes shut. Something shuffled by the door. Something scratched at the metal. Then something heavy slammed onto the roof of the trailer. Once. Again. Again. The whole cabin shuddered. A mug fell off the shelf and shattered. The shift log slid off the table. At some point, the blows stopped. And then, against my own will, I looked toward the window. Outside, beyond the dirty glass, stood a figure. Not a person. Not even a shadow. More like a piece of darkness gathered into something vaguely human-shaped. Very tall. Too narrow. Like black smoke given form. It had no face, but where a face should have been, 2 dim pale smudges glowed like eyes. If eyes could smolder in fog. The figure stood motionless, one long black hand pressed against the glass. I even felt the cold. Real, physical cold. My breath fogged the air as if the temperature inside the trailer had suddenly dropped. It was looking for me. For a few seconds, or maybe forever, we seemed to look at each other. Then, the figure slowly tilted its head, the way a curious animal might, and it smiled. I don't know how you can see a smile where there is no face, but I saw it, and it was worse than any snarl. Then, it stepped away from the window and disappeared into the rain. I sat there until dawn without moving. Friday dragged by painfully. It should have been my last full day before pickup. And I suppose the thing, if it was a thing, somehow sensed that its time was running out too. The site was unusually quiet during the day. Even the rain had stopped, the sky cleared, but the sun never came out. Everything looked washed and dead. I made only one short round and spent the rest of the day sitting in the trailer. I hardly wanted to eat. Exhaustion made me nauseous. My eyes burned, my hands shook, and my head throbbed from lack of sleep and constant tension. At one point, I nearly decided to run from the site on foot. Just open the gate and walk the road until I reached the highway. But as soon as I imagined the night road through the empty lots and abandoned industrial zone, it was obvious that would be even worse. And night was not far off anyway. I told myself I only had to survive one more night, the last one. In the morning, they'd come get me. Right. As soon as the sun went down, the generator started running unevenly again. It didn't die, but its sound became strange, quieter, then louder, as if the engine were choking and recovering. I went out 3 times to check it. Fuel was fine, wiring was fine. But every time I returned to the trailer, the sound began wavering again. Around 10 at night, something seemed to drag a length of chain across the site. A dull metallic clatter rolled from the gate toward the far building. Then it went quiet. A little after 11, somebody knocked on the trailer door. Not like before. Quiet, careful. This was confident. Knock, knock, knock. I froze. Then it came again. "Matt!" Jack's voice called. "Open up! Now!" I didn't answer. "I came to get you early. Open up!" The words sounded clear, almost real. I crawled closer to the window but didn't dare look outside. "Matt, we've got a problem. Open up." Then he added something that twisted my stomach. "I saw you go into the first building today." I went still, my face numb with fear. Nobody but me could have known that. I had been there alone during the day, on an empty site. "I told you not to go where you shouldn't," the voice went on. "Now we have to leave. Open up." For several seconds, I forgot to breathe entirely. Then, someone on the other side of the door let out a heavy sigh, and Jack's smoke-roughened voice said almost gently, "It's already close, Matt." After that, something hit the door so hard the whole trailer jolted. The flashlight fell from the wall. The table shifted. I stumbled back toward the bed. The blow came again and again. Then a sickening scraping sound dragged across the metal, as though something outside were slowly running something sharp along the frame, feeling for a weak point. "Open," the voice said. Now it didn't sound like Jack anymore. It didn't sound human at all. The words came out as if forced through a wet, swollen throat not made for speech. "Open!" The next impact was so strong that one of the windows cracked. I really couldn't understand why this thing, with that kind of strength, couldn't simply tear apart the thin trailer. Why it kept knocking, begging, commanding. The only explanation was in the note. It could not enter unless invited. And if that was true, then the door was the last thin line between me and whatever waited outside. The blows went on for a very long time. Sometimes the voice changed between them. It spoke in my mother's voice, in an old friend's voice, in a child's voice, in my own. It called me, begged me, threatened me, promised me things, laughed. At times, it felt as though there were several creatures outside, not one. But whenever I heard footsteps circling the trailer, they were always only one set. Heavy, slow, deliberate. Toward dawn, everything fell silent so abruptly, it was as if someone had switched the sound off. At first, I didn't believe it. I sat there waiting for another blow, Another voice, another scrape, but instead I saw gray dawn light beginning to seep through a crack in the curtain. I had survived the night. I was shaking so badly I could barely stand. My whole body felt numb and hollow. But inside the fear, another feeling stirred as well, an almost animal kind of hope. Morning, Saturday. They'd be here soon. I didn't go outside until it was fully light. The site looked like it did after any bad weather. Puddles, wet concrete, tarp, a heavy sky. No sign at all of the madness of the night. Only the metal around the trailer door was carved with deep gouges, and the window really had cracked. It hadn't been imagination, or hysteria, or a dream. I stood in front of the trailer, squinting in the pale light, and felt like a man who had crawled back from the dead, but didn't fully believe it yet. Around 8 in the morning, a pickup truck pulled up at the gate. I heard the engine and nearly cried with relief. The man driving was not Jack, someone else. Younger, short hair, clean work jacket, and an orange safety vest. About 30, maybe. He looked utterly ordinary, alive, real. I almost ran to the gate. He rolled down the window. "You Matt?" he asked. "Yes, yeah, that's me. Where's Jack?" The man frowned. "What Jack?" "Jack Morgan, the foreman. He brought me here." The man was silent for a couple of seconds. "I don't know any Jack Morgan," he said. "They sent me from the office to pick up the night watchman and bring in the new one for next week if you're leaving." It felt like being hit in the head. "What do you mean you don't know him?" "He hired me. We drove here together. He gave me the instructions. The man looked at me, the way people look at someone after a serious illness or a long binge. "Listen, buddy," he said carefully. "There used to be a site supervisor here named John Morris, but he died here 6 months ago. Fell down the elevator shaft during shutdown. I felt the ground disappear under me." "No," I said. "No. His name was Jack. Jack Morgan." The man shrugged. "I don't know anyone by that name." I wanted to scream, grab his jacket, drag him into the trailer, show him the entries, the claw marks on the door, the notebook, anything. But when I turned toward the trailer, another chill went through me. The black notebook was gone from the table. I ran inside, upturned my things, opened the cabinet, looked under the bed. Nothing. No shift journal, no note. Just my belongings, the food, the broken mug, and the cracked window. I knew for a fact I had left the notebook on the table. The younger man leaned into the trailer and frowned harder. "You okay?" I looked at him and understood I would never be able to explain any of it. Even if I told him everything exactly as it happened, he'd either think I'd gone insane from isolation or simply wouldn't believe me. And at that moment, even I barely believed myself. I grabbed my backpack and got into the truck. As we drove out through the gate, I looked at the construction site one last time. On the 4th floor of the first building, in an empty window opening, someone was standing. A man in a yellow hard hat, facing the wall. I blinked, and the opening was empty. I didn't look back again. The drive back passed like a fever dream. The man said something about payment, paperwork, maybe the site being sold to another company soon, so they'd stop keeping night watchmen there. I answered at random. My whole body ached as if I'd been beaten for a day straight. My eyes kept trying to close, but I was terrified of falling asleep. It felt as though if I did, I'd hear the scraping, the knocking, and my own voice outside the door all over again. They really did pay me. Not immediately, but that same afternoon. The amount was even higher than promised. Probably as compensation for what no one intended to warn me about in advance. The office manager, a young woman with an unnaturally bright smile, pushed the papers toward me and didn't ask a single extra question, as if she knew that people who came back from that site either kept quiet or never returned at all. When she asked whether I'd be willing to take another week there after a break, I looked at her in such a way that her smile died on its own. No, I said, never. She only nodded, far too calmly for someone who had just been refused by a supposedly hard-to-find worker. And that calm convinced me of one thing completely. They knew, all of them knew. They just preferred not to say it out loud. Hiring new people was easier than admitting that there was something on that site no sane person would stay with for more than a single shift. For the first few days after I got back, I barely slept. The moment I closed my eyes, I saw the trailer window, the black hand on the glass, the pale glowing smudges where eyes should have been. Several times at night, I woke up convinced I heard the generator rattling outside my own window. Once I jumped out of bed because I clearly heard 3 knocks at my door. But there was no one there, of course. I tried to find at least some information about the site. I searched the address, the developer's name, the district, anything. I found news reports about the accident. It was true. Someone had died there 6 months earlier. But his name wasn't John Morris or Jack Morgan. It was something else. In different articles, the name changed. Jonathan Myers in one place, Michael Morgan in another. It was as though even the official details couldn't stay straight in this story. I also found a couple of posts on a local forum where people were talking about the strange frozen construction site outside town. Someone wrote that lights burned on the upper floors at night, even though there was no electricity. Someone else claimed they had seen a worker on the grounds standing with his face to the wall. One guy said he and his friends had climbed in there to film videos and heard someone calling them by name from the underground level. The comments, of course, were mixed. Half were laughing, half were telling everyone to smoke less weed. But I read all of it and felt that same cold rising inside me again. One detail bothered me more than anything. Who was Jack? If the man who hired me and drove me to the site didn't exist, or at least wasn't among the living employees, then who had been sitting beside me in that truck? Who had smoked, talked, shown me the trailer, explained the generator, the rounds, the warning not to go into the buildings? And why had he several times, almost casually, given the exact pieces of advice that later matched the note? At one point, a thought came to me that made everything even worse. What if he hadn't been some accidental helper at all, but the opposite? What if someone or something had been bringing people to that site itself, disguising itself as a foreman to lure in a new victim? But if that was true, then why had I survived? I still don't have an answer. Sometimes I think that notebook saved me. Somebody's desperate attempt to leave instructions for the next person while there was still time. Somebody's tiny act of defiance that kept me from opening the door that night. Kept me from going outside to the dead generator. Kept me from approaching the figure facing the wall. But then another question appears. If the notebook was real, where did it go in the morning? Why wasn't there a single page, a single scrap of proof left, except the claw marks on the door that could be explained away as anything? Sometimes I catch myself thinking that the place wasn't just trying to scare me. It was studying me, memorizing me, tasting my name, my voice, my fears. And if it hadn't managed to get to me back there on the site, that didn't mean it had forgotten. A month after the whole thing, I got a call from an unknown number. I stared at the screen for a long time before answering. Hello? For a couple of seconds, there was only static, and then I heard Jack's voice. Low, raspy, tired. Matt, he said, another shift just opened up. I dropped the phone. When I picked it up, the line was already dead. The number didn't register. A minute later, the call vanished from the history, as if it had never existed. Since then, I never answer unknown numbers at night. And one more thing. Sometimes when I pass large construction sites, especially abandoned or half-empty ones, I catch myself looking up toward the upper floors, just to check. I don't even know why. Maybe I keep hoping to prove to myself that all of it is in the past and won't happen again. But a couple of times now, it has seemed to me that I've seen the familiar figure again. A man in a yellow hard hat, standing perfectly still, facing the wall, waiting for somebody to call out to him first.